Good evening. Yeah, if you could take this time to go ahead and silence your phones, and then if you wouldn't mind standing so we can join together in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. So good evening, everyone. My name is James Mismash. I am a two-time intern of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute, and I am a student at the University of Texas at Austin, where I study government and history with a focus on World War II and the Holocaust. It's an honor to welcome you here to the Annenberg Presidential Learning Center at the Reagan Foundation here in Simi Valley, California, where we'll have the opportunity to hear from empowering and motivated college students from across the United States of America on how we as young adults can and already do make substantial changes in our community, and specifically, substantial positive changes in our community. The Reagan Foundation is a special place for many people for a variety of reasons. For some, it's a place where they can come and reflect on an era or a time that they were maybe voting for president or America they wish to see. For others, it's a time that they can pay their respects to the man for whom this place was built. And for people like me and those around, it fosters learning opportunities, it inspires connections, and it presents challenges for younger generations. Questions are asked like, how do we move forward? What lessons do we take from the past? And with an ever-changing nation and political climate, how do we, as young adults and students, become cornerstones of change? At the third annual Reagan Leadership Summit here today, we're going to talk about what these difficult questions offer and how we can answer them and create that positive change. We're going to challenge ourselves to be vulnerable and to take advantage of the networks and people that are around us and take advantage of the advice that we're going to be given by the wonderful students who are here today. Tonight, we come to recognize ourselves for who we are and what we're striving to become, bridge builders and trailblazers. So what does it mean to be a bridge builder? To say that, I say we start with what is a bridge. As we all know, it's a structure that connects two seemingly divided sides. Today, our generation more frequently is asked to choose a side than it is to find common ground. We're encouraged to build our defense before building a relationship. President Reagan's leadership in Washington, D.C. provides a wonderful example how even amidst our enemies, we're amidst our friends. We're simply human, and we can be exactly that, simply friends together. During President Reagan's presidency, there was a Democratic House majority with Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill. While little grand policy measures were probably agreed upon by the two, and they would spend hours debating, arguing, talking about what America looked like from each of their sides, they kind of had a special 6 o'clock friendship, as I've seen it called. So after that day or days filled with arguments and those debates on policy measures, they were able to come together and talk about family, to talk about life and the country that they loved together. They were able to put those things aside once the day was over and come together as exactly what we are and what I said before, and come together as people. And that's what we're here today to do, is talk about how as members of a generation often forced to alienate ourselves from each other to become bridge builders so that we can hold true to who we are, which is essentially people, and to foster a peoplehood of friendliness, of love, and humanity. Bridge builders create their structural foundation filled with integrity, and they do it with drive. But their purpose is always that middle ground where the last stone is laid, where it truly becomes a connecting point of those divided sides. Never lose sight of that middle ground. Now, trailblazers, those are bridge builders with fire. They recognize the power of a connecting point they just built. They invite people from the other side over, and they're not afraid to ask for help and certainly never back down from a challenge. Yesterday on my flight here, I sat between a 6-year-old pretty conservative person and a 35-year-old, as they would say it, liberal-leaning independent who's fairly moderate, which is a little bit of a long title, but we'll take it. And during our 2.5-hour flight, where I thought I would have my headphones in and be listening to music and reading my new book, I had the honor to have pleasant conversations with them about where we're going politically. We had some people watching the debate on the other side of the aisle, and not political aisle, the literal plane aisle. And In those 2 hours, we were able to have more bipartisan, substantive conversations about what it means to challenge ourselves and to grow as not just political leaders, but as people. And I think we were able to achieve that because we all had that middle ground in mind. We were trailblazers in that conversation, and they were inspired by the fact that there are youth out there that are looking to be trailblazers. So I had the opportunity to tell them about all of you, and they had a few tips for advice. They said to make sure that we're passionate about the world, that we believed we had the power to do something good for the world, and most importantly, that we're not afraid to take action on it. The people that you're going to hear from today are individuals who definitely have not feared taking action on their passion, and we encourage you to make sure and take action on your passion as well. Whether your dream is to be a parent, a business leader, a teacher, or anywhere in between, be a passionate trailblazer. Now, it wouldn't be a Reagan Foundation event if we didn't throw in a little bit of a fun Reagan joke or a little bit of Reagan humor, so humor me this. So one of his favorite stories and jokes were often about the farms and countries, and so President Reagan always asked for the scene to be set, and he would use Kansas, but I'm a Texas boy, so I'm going to use Texas. So there's a Texas farmer, and he just retired his ranch, thousands of acres of corn and cotton, but he decides, you know what, it's time to just grow a nice, subtle garden that can provide some fruits and vegetables for the family. So he's going around his land looking for a good spot to cultivate this garden, and he goes down to the creek bed. There's a little bit of water, maybe a little bit of damp soil, but it's very rocky and tumultuous, so he decides to spend a couple months down there clearing it out. So he goes down and clears out all the rocks and pulls out all the weeds, cultivates the soil, makes sure it's nice and healthy, filled with the nutrients it needs to produce those vegetables. So he plants some green beans and some tomatoes and some corn. So after a few months, he's looking around and he sees the tomato, and it's nice. It's a big, ripe tomato, and he looks at the green beans, and some healthy-looking green beans, probably the best in the community, which I think is Waxahachie, which is where I'm from. Wow, great farmer. And then he looks at the corn, and some pretty high corn stalks. So he's pretty proud of himself, and he'd been going to church a lot frequently, so he's telling his pastor about how good this garden was ending up. So he invites the pastor down next Sunday. He goes to church, and he's like, why don't you come check out the garden I've been telling you about? So the pastor comes down after church that Sunday and goes down, and they go down to the creek bed, and they look at the tomato, and he pulls out, why, my goodness, that's the biggest tomato I've ever seen. God has really produced a good tomato. So they walk over a few more yards, and they pick up a green bean, and they pull it out, and he's like, wow, this is a nice green bean. Thank goodness the Lord has provided that for us. And then he goes to the corn stalk a couple feet away, and looks up, and it's towering down on him, and he says, wow, the Lord knows how to grow some corn. And the farmer is getting a little antsy and a little nervous, and the pastor looks at him and is like, what's going on? He's like, well, you should have seen this garden when the Lord was doing it alone. No? Okay. I guess I'm not President Reagan, but I thought it was pretty funny. Well, the moral of the story is, A, it's funny, and B, it's really hard to achieve positive results whenever you're doing something alone. And today we're here to gather to talk about those relationships we can make to be trailblazers, maybe not garden growers, but trailblazers and bridge builders in our community. In the beginning of my speech, I said that we came here, or many people come here, to pay their respects to the place for whom come to this place for whom it was built for. But I'll let you in on a little secret. The Reagan Foundation wasn't built for President Reagan, it was built to honor him. President Reagan wanted this place to be built for all of you. It's a learning opportunity. It's a place where he wanted people to come and learn from the past and be motivated to make a difference in their community based on the mission and examples that he had set. The purpose and mission of the Reagan Foundation and our education team is to support and encourage building bridges and blazing trails. Today, we're so lucky to have empowered trailblazers and bridge builders in our midst, those who inspire to be empowering. So build a bridge with those in the room today and those around you, and use today to spark a trailblazing fire of passion within you. Thank you for coming, and let's start changing the world. At this time, I'd like to welcome up the Chief Learning Officer of the Reagan Foundation, Mr. Tony Penny.
Good job on the joke. All right, good evening, everybody. So thank you very much, James, for kicking us off here. Before we get started with my part, I just want to recognize a couple of friends and VIPs who we have in the audience. First, we have our Executive Director, Mr. John Highbush, who's joining us this evening. Thanks, John, for being here. And then we have Jason and his friends from the Super Joey Foundation. Jason, thank you so much for the work that you do. And many of you brought toys and canned goods and stuff like that. And we're working with the Super Joey Foundation to make sure those get donated to the Ronald McDonald House. So thank you so much for being here tonight. Okay, I want to get a sense of who is in the room. First, we're going to go age-wise. Anybody in here in middle school? Any middle school students? Middle school student. Awesome. Thank you so much. It's okay. You can raise your hand high. Be proud. You're the only ones out. Everybody else had to stay home tonight. You're here. It's awesome. High school students. How many high school students? Nice. We got a lot of high school students. What about college? Any college students? Excellent, excellent. And what about people like me, students of life? Never stop learning. There we go. We got a few life students. Okay, excellent. Now, program alumni. How many of you have been through our Air Force One Discovery Center? Is anybody through the Discovery Center, the simulation we have? Okay, a couple of you. How many of you have been a part of one of our programs, like the Student Leadership Program? Got a few of our student leadership. How many of you have earned scholarships from us? Any scholarship recipients here? We give out over $1 million in scholarships each year. So if you're in high school, you haven't graduated yet, think about it. Any other program alums? Any other programs at all? Interns? I know we have a few former interns. Okay, so a number of former interns, great communicators. Excellent. If you haven't been an alumni, if this is your first time out, raise your hand. First time at a Reagan Foundation event. Excellent. What I know about all these hands, this will not be your last time at a Reagan Foundation event. We're going to have a good time tonight. So it's my job tonight to introduce our keynote speaker. So we searched far and wide for someone who could speak effectively on the theme of trailblazers and bridge builders, and we lucked out. It turns out we have a speaker who's an expert on the theme, has incredible name recognition, and is not only important to this community, but is important to the country. Indeed, important to the history of the world. Any guesses? Oh my gosh, 2 points for you. Write it down, 2 points. 2 points, House Gryffindor. All right, I'll give you a hint. So they built a museum right here to honor him, and you're right, it's Ronald Reagan. So our 40th president, Ronald Reagan, we have pulled clips from a few of his speeches, and clips that I think shed some light on our theme tonight. So if you'll allow me, I'm going to serve as your guide through a very unique keynote address that spans from the beginning of his time in office to the very end. So, Trailblazers. You think Trailblazers, you probably think the Portland Trailblazers, right? Basketball fans, C.J. McCollum, Dame Lillard, Clyde Drexler, if you're an old school Trailblazers fan. That's not what we're talking about tonight, and James told us about it, right? Trailblazers, people who blaze trails, are literally people who look at a patch of rocky grass, and they look at the top of a hill, and there's no way to get there, and they look and they say, you know what, I'm going that way. I'm going to go up that hill. And they're not people who just want to get up there for themselves, right? Trailblazers, the act of blazing a trail, literally means you're going to create a trail so that other people can follow along. And if you look at the long history of our country, we live in a country that has been defined by people who are trailblazers. From the pilgrims who crossed the sea to be here for religious freedom, to the pioneers who headed west, to the framers of our country who were blazing trails and the ideas about what self-governance and freedom meant. We had trailblazers, women who cast votes when they knew they shouldn't be doing it. They were going to get thrown in jail, but they cast a vote anyways because they wanted their sisters and their daughters and their granddaughters to be able to cast votes. We had trailblazers in the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement, young men and women, African-American students who sat at the counter at Woolworths and ordered a meal knowing full well they wouldn't be served because they knew that they wanted the future generations to sit down and enjoy the very fruits of freedom that they were promised by the American creed. So we have a long history of trailblazers in this country. That gives us to the context for when our keynote speaker for tonight came into office, the 1980s. 1980 is when he was elected, right? So as a nation, we were experiencing some tough times. On the international front, we were more than 3 decades into the Cold War. Both sides had literally tens of thousands of nuclear weapons, and if we ever got into an actual fight, we could have wiped half of the planet's population out in just a few minutes. On the domestic front, inflation was high. There were gas shortages. We had American hostages being held in Iran. Cars, if you ever see pictures of New York in the late 70s, Central Park, a beautiful park, one of the great public spaces in our country, there were just junk cars that were kind of parked in the middle of it, overrun. So things were so rough during President Reagan, during the run-up to his election, that people thought disco was a good idea. We know that's not true. After the scandals of Watergate, people were losing faith in the presidency, in our government, and in America itself. So into this dark situation stepped President Reagan, a man who wanted to blaze a different type of trail for America. And so this first clip we're playing is from his very first speech, his first inaugural speech when he became the president.
It is time for us to realize that we're too great a nation to limit ourselves to small dreams. We're not, as some would have us believe, doomed to an inevitable decline. I do not believe in a fate that will fall on us no matter what we do. I do believe in a fate that will fall on us if we do nothing. So with all the creative energy at our command, let us begin an era of national renewal. Let us renew our determination, our courage, and our strength. And let us renew our faith and our hope. We have every right to dream heroic dreams. Those who say that we're in a time when there are no heroes, they just don't know where to look. You can see heroes every day going in and out of factory gates. Others, a handful in number, produce enough food to feed all of us and then the world beyond. You meet heroes across a counter, and they're on both sides of that counter. There are entrepreneurs with faith in themselves and faith in an idea who create new jobs, new wealth, and opportunity. They're individuals and families who take taxes, support the government, and whose voluntary gifts support church, charity, culture, art, and education. Their patriotism is quiet but deep. Their values sustain our national life. Now, I have used the words they and their in speaking of these heroes. I could say you and your, because I'm addressing the heroes of whom I speak, you, the citizens of this blessed land. Your dreams, your hopes, your goals are going to be the dreams, the hopes, and the goals of this administration, so help me God.
Excellent. So what I want you to do, when you checked in today, you got a backpack. There should be a notebook in there. If you don't have a notebook, I see some of you have notebooks out, but go ahead and pull that notebook out. I used to be a teacher, so you'll forgive me if I dip into my teaching background and ask you to do homework on a Friday night right before the holiday break. I'm not going to apologize for it. I'm just going to tell you that we're going to do it. So here's 3 words. You don't have to write these down unless you really want to. You can, but your assignment's coming forward. 3 words that really stand out from that inaugural address for me when it comes to the theme of blazing trails. One is dreams. If you're a trailblazer, that means that you're a dreamer. You look at a place that has no trail and say, I'm going to create a trail there, right? You have to have a degree of imagination, so you have to be a dreamer. Number 2, heroes. What I love about the way that he defines heroes and talks about heroes is he doesn't say that heroes are mythological creatures or the stories we hear about. He says heroes are everyday people, the citizens, right? Citizens is a beautiful word. If you look at the history of the word citizen, it comes from a lot of different things that mean community, people coming together, civilization, a lot of people together, right? Cities are people together, civic duty, a civic center. In fact, in the ancient Roman tradition, being called a citizen was one of the highest honors you could be. The Emperor Augustus had a crown. It was called the corona civica. It comes from the same root, which meant that the highest possible thing you could do was save the life of a fellow citizen. So that's what we're talking about here. So Ronald Reagan, when he's thinking about and painting this picture of this world that he believes in and the world that he wants to help create as President of the United States, that's what he's thinking about. So here's what I want you to do. We're going to take 2 minutes. You have in front of you a piece of paper. You're here, you chose to come here on a Friday night because you're interested in leadership, because you're interested in blazing trails and building bridges. I want you to take 1 minute. I want you to write down, what's the picture that you would paint? If you were the leader, the world that you want to see. You could write a sentence. You could write a word. You could draw a picture if you want. But I want you to write something down. I want you to put that picture in your mind. You have 1.5 minutes. Give you another 30 seconds or so. My job is to frustrate you slightly. If you can't write everything, that's good. It means there's an urgency to what you're writing. You're taking it seriously. Okay, you can keep writing if you want. We're going to come back to that. Hold on to that. So clip number two, what we're going to talk about is once you start blazing that trail, once you turn on that light and start walking, once people believe in you and your cause and the promise of what you might do together, you have to keep going. So if you blaze a trail and no one follows, you're not really blazing a trail, right? You're just kind of walking up a hill by yourself. A little weird. You want to bring other people along, right? So one of the ways in which President Reagan was a trailblazer was in the way that he chose his first Supreme Court nominee. So when he was the president, one of the most important jobs a president have is to appoint people to the Supreme Court. So for his first choice, he made a choice that changed history. So I'm going to play the speech and then we'll talk about it. So if we could see the next clip, please.
As a president, I can make an appointment to the United States Supreme Court. Those who sit in the Supreme Court interpret the laws of our land and truly do leave their footprints on the sands of time. Long after the policies of presidents and senators and congressmen of any given era may have passed from public memory, they'll be remembered. After very careful review and consideration, I have made a decision as to my nominee to fill the vacancy on the United States Supreme Court created by the resignation of Justice Stewart. Since I'm aware of the great amount of speculation about this appointment, I want to share this very important decision with you as soon as possible. Needless to say, most of the speculation is centered on the question of whether I would consider a woman to fill this first vacancy. As the press has accurately pointed out, during my campaign for the presidency, I made a commitment that one of my first appointments to the Supreme Court vacancy would be the most qualified woman that I could possibly find. Now, this is not to say that I would appoint a woman merely to do so. That would not be fair to women, nor to future generations of all Americans whose lives are so deeply affected by decisions of the court. Rather, I pledge to appoint a woman who meets the very high standards that I demand of all court appointees. I have identified such a person. So today, I'm pleased to announce that upon completion of all the necessary checks by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, I will send to the Senate the nomination of Judge Sandra Day O'Connor of Arizona Court of Appeals for confirmation as an Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court. She is truly a person for all seasons, possessing those unique qualities of temperament, fairness, intellectual capacity, and devotion to the public good which have characterized the 101 brethren who have preceded her. I commend her to you, and I urge the Senate's swift bipartisan confirmation so that as soon as possible she may take her seat on the court and her place in history.
So that speech is not one of President Reagan's most famous speeches. It wasn't particularly eloquent, it wasn't particularly poetic, but it changed history in a really powerful way. You see, before he nominated Justice O'Connor to the court, the Supreme Court had been in existence for 192 years. There had been 101 justices nominated to the Supreme Court, and not one had been a woman. And so President Reagan, in that way, was a trailblazer. He created an opportunity that had never been there before. Young women who studied the law could now look to the Supreme Court of the United States and imagine themselves as Supreme Court justices. And by choosing her, he chose a woman who was a trailblazer in her own right. If you know anything about the history of Sandra Day O'Connor, she went to Stanford, one of the great law schools in the country, graduated near the top of her class. When she graduated, she could not find a job in any law firm. She literally interviewed and tried to get jobs at hundreds of different law firms. One law firm, she sat down across from a man who looked at her credentials, who met with her, and he said, "You have amazing credentials. You are eminently qualified for this job, but I'm not going to hire you. Because if I hired a woman lawyer, our firm would be laughed out of the business." So Sandra Day O'Connor, to get her first job as a lawyer, volunteered for a county office. They didn't even have a desk for her. She said, "I will share a desk with the secretary." She was so committed to the law. She was so committed to her vision of what the Constitution meant that she would do that. She could have easily walked away from a profession that did not want her. And now there's been several other women who have been appointed to the Supreme Court following. So lesson number 2 on leadership. Once you get on that trail and once you're trailblazing, you got to get with other right people on that trail who are blazing their own trails, and you can blaze trails together. So here's what I want you to do. You wrote down something just a minute ago. By being here tonight, you're saying you want to be a leader. You believe that somewhere within you is a little bit of trailblazer. So I want you to introduce yourself to 2 people you've never talked to before. So look around the room, get up, you can find someone. Introduce yourself, tell them your name, and just really briefly tell them what you wrote down, what it is that you're interested in. And I'm going to give you 2 minutes. So if you only get to 1, you really start talking, that's fine. You can reconnect later at the reception, but I want you to do a little bit of networking. Get up, introduce yourself, share your vision, ready, go. Okay, you have about 1 more minute, about 1 more minute. Okay, about 20 seconds, about 20 seconds. If you want to wrap up your introduction and head back to your seat. Yeah. About 15 seconds, about 15 seconds. All right, I hate to do this just as you're getting to know each other, you're reaching out. I'm going to ask you to return to your seats. It's good practice. After this, we have the reception. You'll do more of this there. We're just doing, this is practice reception stuff. So if I could have everybody please return to your seats. Oh, thank you. Excellent. Hopefully you got a chance to meet somebody new. There'll be plenty of time to follow up on those conversations and meet even more people at the reception afterwards. But what you were just doing was literally the physical act of building bridges, making connections to other people you might not know. So this next clip I want to play comes from 1988. So August of 1988, as President Reagan's presidency is wrapping up. A little bit of context. December 7th, 1941. Anybody know that day? What happened that day? History people. Pearl Harbor, right? So the Japanese Navy did a sneak attack on Pearl Harbor, took out much of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. As a result of that attack, in addition to getting the U.S. into World War II, President Roosevelt signed something called Executive Order 9066, which meant that more than 100,000 Japanese people were rounded up, their assets, their homes, their businesses seized, and they were shipped off to incarceration camps across the country. The majority of these people were American citizens. None of them had any trial or due process or anything like that. And some who were desperate to prove their loyalty to the country volunteered to sign up. They said, we want to fight. We want to prove that we're Americans. And so they signed up to be part of the 442nd Regiment, a unit of the Army infantry that was comprised of Japanese Americans who were known for their ferocity. In fact, it's the single most decorated unit in American military history. They earned more than 9,000 Purple Hearts, more than 4,000 Bronze Stars, 21 Medal of Honors. It's a really incredible story. Yet despite that, and despite their incredible war record, when the war was over, and the Japanese returned from these camps, and the soldiers came back, some of the soldiers had been killed, there were some communities that didn't want the Japanese soldiers buried in their communities. They still had a lot of resentment from the war. So there was one in particular, a man by the name of Kazuo Masuda, who had been killed in combat fighting the Nazis. His family wanted him buried near their home. Many in the community were against it. So the Army sent out kind of a public relations team. And one of the young officers, a captain, a former actor, made a speech and said that blood that is soaked into the sands of the beach is all one color. America is unique in the world because we were founded not on a race, but on an ideal. The community, moved by his words, ended up supporting Kazuo being buried near his home. So fast forward 4 decades. Many in the Japanese community had long advocated for some form of acknowledgement of what had happened during World War II. And several who had been either incarcerated or had fought as members of the 442nd held prominent positions in the government. They asked President Reagan to sign something called the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. And here's what he said the day he signed it.
Members of Congress and distinguished guests, my fellow Americans, we gather here today to right a grave wrong. More than 40 years ago, shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, 120,000 persons of Japanese ancestry living in the United States were forcibly removed from their homes and placed in makeshift internment camps. This action was taken without trial, without jury. It was based solely on race, for these 120,000 were Americans of Japanese descent. Yes, the nation was then at war, struggling for its survival, and it's not for us today to pass judgment upon those who may have made mistakes while engaged in that great struggle. Yet we must recognize that the internment of Japanese Americans was just that, a mistake.
So here President Reagan is building bridges in a lot of different ways. So one, he's building a bridge to the Japanese American community that had long felt like they weren't part of the same American dream as their counterparts. Two, he's building a national bridge from the present, at least the present of 1988, to a very painful part of our past. Some say one of the greatest mistakes our government has ever made. But he's also building a very personal bridge between the present and the past, because remember we talked about that young Army captain who made the speech? That was Ronald Reagan as a young man, well before he was president or governor. So our lesson number 3, what's a bridge that we can build? So I want you to think about this. I want you to write this down. What's a bridge that you can build? Reaching out to a relative, an old friend, someone in need of help. A bridge that you can make in your community, at your school, in your home. So I want you to write it down. I'll give you a minute. If you want to keep writing while I talk, that's fine. I'm going to move on, but you can keep writing if you need to. It's good to write. Because sometimes bridge building, this 4th clip we're going to talk about, sometimes bridge building means destroying something that stands in the way of the bridge you need to build. So for example, if you're building a tunnel for cars and goods and people to move from one side of a mountain to the other, sometimes you have to use some dynamite to get through that tunnel, right? So for those who get the quick version of Ronald Reagan and what he meant to history, you're probably familiar with his arguably most famous 4-word phrase, tear down this wall. He stood at the Brandenburg Gate in Germany, close to a wall that separated East from West, and it was a physical representation of the divide between freedom and tyranny, between Soviets and Americans. And sometimes the story we get in our history class is that he said, tear down this wall, and it came down and the Cold War was over. Well, it wasn't quite that easy. I want to thank Chris Adams, who's our great Communicator debate series coordinator for this comparison. But she gave this speech kind of a comparison to the Hunger Games. Any Hunger Games fans? A few. Yeah, there you go. There you go, Megan. Thank you. Yeah. Katniss Everdeen. You remember Katniss Everdeen? As she kind of moves to the Capitol, she goes straight to the very heart of the discord that's in the Hunger Games and challenges President Snow in his backyard. Well, in some ways, that's what President Reagan does. He goes to Berlin and makes the speech right in front of this wall. And here's what he says.
Our gathering today is being broadcast throughout Western Europe and North America. I understand that it is being seen and heard as well in the East. To those listening throughout Eastern Europe, I extend my warmest greetings and the goodwill of the American people. To those listening in East Berlin, a special word. Although I cannot be with you, I address my remarks to you just as surely as to those standing here before me. For I join you, as I join your fellow countrymen in the West, in this firm, this unalterable belief, es gibt nur ein Berlin. Behind me stands a wall that encircles the free sectors of this city, part of a vast system of barriers that divides the entire continent of Europe. From the Baltic south, those barriers cut across Germany in a gash of barbed wire, concrete, dog runs, and guard towers. Farther south, there may be no visible, no obvious wall, but there remain armed guards and checkpoints all the same. Still a restriction on the right to travel. Still an instrument to impose upon ordinary men and women the will of a totalitarian state. Yet it is here in Berlin where the wall emerges most clearly. Here, cutting across your city, where the news photo and the television screen have imprinted this brutal division of a continent upon the mind of the world. Standing before the Brandenburg Gate, every man is a German, separated from his fellow men. Every man is a Berliner, forced to look upon a scar.
So we'll pause there. What I love about what he does here, so this is early in the speech. The famous part is the tear down this wall, right? Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity, come to this gate, open this gate, tear down this wall. This is the early part. Rhetorically, he's building his argument for why that wall needs to be torn down. So some of you may be fans of Simon Sinek. Does anybody know Simon Sinek? He has a great TEDx talk called Start With Why. So the what here is what's really famous. What are we going to do? We're going to tear down this wall. But the why are we going to tear down this wall is what's really important, and that's what he says here. He says, every man is a German. Every man is a German. Meaning, when we stand here and we look at this wall, it's not just the Germans who have this problem. It's not just the Germans who are divided between the freedom of the West and the tyranny of the East. It's every man and woman in this world. And what we can do about it is we can have a common humanity with them. So he's building a bridge between this idea that all people are entitled to freedom. And if all people are entitled to freedom, then what's happening here in Germany with this wall needs to be changed. And that's why he's calling for the wall to be torn down. And that's his why. All people are entitled to freedom. So here's what I want you to do. Leadership tip number 4, build these bridges between people and ideas. So I want you to think about, what's your why? What is it that's important to you? And for 1 minute, I want you to share with somebody at your table. What's your why? What are the things, the ideas that drive you to do the things that you want to do to help make this world a better place? So I'll give you a minute. Share with someone at your table. All right. So I'm going to ask you to wrap up, hold on to that. I'm giving you all sorts of nuggets to hold on to and carry on a little bit further at the reception. And I'm going to end with one last clip. Now, this one is incredibly personal for me. So this is the beginning of my own personal connection with Ronald Reagan, and one of the reasons why I feel like I was pulled to work here. So in 1986, January of 1986, I was in the 3rd grade. And like many of the school children across the country, I was watching on TV the launch of the Space Shuttle Challenger. So in those days, watching something on TV meant my teacher would wheel this giant kind of box of a television into the classroom. It would have a seat belt over it so it wouldn't fall down and break. And we'd all kind of gather and we'd sit on the floor, crisscross applesauce. We were excited because a teacher named Krista McAuliffe was going to be on this space shuttle. She was going to space. And so that was a really huge moment for education. And for kids, we were excited. So we watched the shuttle launched, and about a minute into the flight, it began to blow up. There was smoke. The Challenger exploded. Everyone on board died. So the nation, the children across the country who'd been watching in their classrooms were in complete shock. Didn't quite know what happened. Our teacher wheeled the TV out of the room and moved on to math. She didn't really talk about it because she didn't know what had happened either. But that night, President Reagan, who was scheduled to make a speech on something else, decided to change the nature of his speech. And he came on television, and I'm going to play a very short clip from this one.
And I want to say something to the school children of America who were watching the live coverage of the shuttle's takeoff. I know it's hard to understand, but painful things like this happen. It's all part of the process of exploration and discovery. It's all part of taking a chance and expanding man's horizons. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave. The Challenger crew was pulling us into the future, and we'll continue to follow them.
So I like that one. I think it's a nice segue into what we have coming next. The idea that the future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted, it belongs to the brave. And I want you to think about, you don't have to write this one down, but I just want you to think about what were the things you would do if you felt just a little braver. If you had the confidence to be that trailblazer who could look at a place where there was no road and say, that's the way I'm walking, that's the way I want to go. If you could look at a giant chasm where there was no bridge and say, I want to get over there. How am I going to do it? I don't care that there's not a bridge here now because I know that I can believe it, because I believe in a future that I myself can create. And so with that, I want to hand it off to speakers who have gone and done some pretty amazing things at creating their own versions of the future. The reason we're here today are 3 outstanding alums, and to introduce them to the stage, Mr. Max Heibusch is going to come up. So thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. My name is Max Heibusch. I'm a sophomore at Viewpoint High School, and I'm a graduate of the 2019 Summer Leadership Program here at the Reagan Library. I found it to be a great program because I learned what good leaders do. They motivate a group of people to achieve a common goal, and they possess the traits needed to help others follow their lead. And that's why I encourage each of you to apply to this program. And for those interested in applying to the program, applications for the Summer Leadership Program 2020 open in early January. But tonight, I'll be introducing our 3 alumni speakers. Our first speaker is Miguel Chavez. Mr. Chavez is a junior at the University of Oklahoma, studying sociology with minors in Latinx studies, women's and gender studies, and nonprofit organizational studies. Miguel is the founder and executive director of Miracle Mindset and has had projects featured by CNN en Español, Telemundo, Instagram, Facebook, the Hispanic Heritage Foundation, and other national publications. Miguel's work is situated at the intersections of college access, poverty, and youth empowerment. Miguel began his association with the Reagan Foundation as a G. Reagan Presidential Scholar in 2017, earning $40,000 in college scholarships. Please welcome Miguel to the stage.
Hi. Okay, I'm gonna go a little bit off script, and I'm sorry, I know we didn't practice this, but I'm just feeling out the energy in the room right now. If we could all stand up, join me in standing. And if we get all stretched, put your arms in the air with me. And now we're gonna go this way. And now we're gonna go to the right. And now we're gonna go to the left. And now we're gonna go to the right. And now one back up down the middle. And now we can be seated. Okay, now we're good. Now we can get started. So, although I was born in the south side of Oklahoma City, my parents, along with the rest of my family, hails from the beautiful mountains of Chihuahua, Mexico. And if I take a moment real quick to close my eyes and reminisce on my childhood, I can still hear that loud Spanish music that filled our house every Saturday morning that would really wake me up way, way earlier than I had any intentions of getting up. And I can still recall those coughing fits that I would get as the smoke would bombard my room when my mom would be grilling those chile serranos to really make a salsa that, frankly, was going to be way too spicy for anybody to really enjoy. And I can still smell the fresh scent of those fresh, scrumptious tamales dulces that my mom would make around this time for the holidays. Shout out. However, none of those feelings were stronger than the sense of hope that left in the sense of fear, anger, and hopelessness that I felt when I was 8 years old that's followed me ever since that burdensome day. And this is where this part of my story begins. So, family has always been a very, very large part of my life. My mom and dad have 9 brothers and sisters, each on each side. Last Christmas around this time, we got together and counted, and it turns out I have more than 400 cousins spread out across all the United States and Mexico. So with that being said, family has always played a very integral part of my life. So when I was 8 years old, we were traveling up from Texas from what had been a very nostalgic family reunion when I popped my little head up and looked out of the backseat of my aunt's car when I saw these glaring red and blue lights flash on. I had no idea what was happening, and before I knew it, we were surrounded by cop cars and border patrol trucks, and I had no idea what was going on. The last thing I remember from that incident was my little cousin being stripped away from my hands, and as I stared at her tear-stained face, she was screaming at me. She said, "Miguel, por favor, no dejes que me lleven. Miguel, please don't let them take me away." After that moment, her and her entire family were crammed into the back of that Border Patrol truck, and it's been more than 10 years since that day, and I haven't seen them since. For years after this incident, I lived paralyzed with the constant fear that at any given moment, my parents could suffer this same fate. So, my parents are undocumented immigrants. And what that means is that growing up, it was really, really hard for them to find work of any kind. Oftentimes growing up, my mom would clean houses, and my dad would look around and find whatever construction jobs he could. So this meant that oftentimes, money was pretty tight around the house. So those sweet, scrumptious tamales dulces on Saturday mornings quickly turned into off-brand Cheerios. So with that being said, my family and my parents had to have the conversation with me. They sat me down and were very genuine, and they said, if you want to pursue higher education, we can't really help you out there. We don't have much advice to give, and we're not going to be able to help you out financially. So this is something that you're going to have to do on your own, and you're going to have to figure it out. However, from the background that I come from, that wasn't really that simple. So I attended a high school that was predominantly African American and Latinx. 90% of the students were on free and reduced lunch, and we had a 40% dropout rate. With that being said, when our counselors would talk to us, they really made it seem that if you made it to community college, if you were just able to graduate high school, then you had exceeded all expectations and you had blown them right out of the water. But my whole life, that just didn't sit right with me. I was like, this can't be everything that is in store for me. This can't be everything that my parents have suffered for, everything that my parents ventured to this country for. This can't be the American dreams that my parents have fought for so long. There has to be something more than that. So, my junior year of high school, I applied and was accepted to attend a program at the University of Chicago. And it was there that this program changed my life. While at the University of Chicago, I met doctors and lawyers, CEOs and authors and dancers who all looked like me, who all had similar stories as I did, who all had overcome similar obstacles as I did. And they allowed me to believe in myself that I could achieve greatness. They told me that that was possible for me, and they made me crazy enough to believe it too. They gave me the key to unlock a door that had previously been shut for me and for my family and for the generations that had come before us. And although it might be hard to believe because, freshman 30 really hits heavy real quick, but I ran cross country my whole life. So once I got that key, I took it and I ran and I never looked back. So I go back home from Chicago and I go through the educational process for my senior year. And by the end of my senior year, I ended up graduating with more than $500,000 worth of private scholarships, and I was accepted to Cornell University. So it worked, right? The dream had paid off. So now that I saw, not only is there a door that exists, B, we have this key, right? Education can be what takes you out of poverty. Education can be that ultimate bridge that uplifts marginalized communities. So I now face the question, what can we do to ensure that this door maintains open, and how can we ensure that as many people as we can come through this door? So in 2017, I created Miracle Mindset. Today, Miracle Mindset is a 501c3 nonprofit and an early outreach program that serves first-generation, low-income high school students from across the entire state of Oklahoma throughout their entire high school careers. Since then, we've worked with more than 500 students and we have awarded thousands of dollars in scholarships. Ultimately, this helps us achieve our mission of transforming today's dreams into tomorrow's realities for these students by eliminating the achievement gap and narrowing the disparity in informational opportunities, resources, and access to education. Through all of these lived experiences, through my involvement with Miracle Mindset, through my involvement in these obstacles and these barriers, I've realized that all of us possess the power to build bridges. The question is, what are we going to do whenever we feel that sense of hopelessness and fear and anger that comes and is derived from the obstacles and barriers that we encounter? Are we going to crumble at the weight of them all? Or are we going to turn and are we going to transform them into this transformative force that can uplift communities, that can build bridges, that can unlock doors that have previously been closed for generations? So today, I stand here before you asking you, no, urging you to please do the latter. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Alexis Slenderman. Ms. Slenderman is a graduate of Western Michigan University and founder of the Scholarship Expert LLC. Alexis has also completed an intensive program through the University of Hong Kong focusing on political economy. Her work to empower foster youth to reach higher levels of education and personal success has resulted in her becoming a federal reviewer for the National Youth in Transition Database and an ambassador for the new Foster Care Ambassador Program. Alexis began her association with the Reagan Foundation as a scholar in Washington, D.C. in 2017 for the Reagan Leadership and the American Presidency Program. Please welcome Alexis to the stage.
I am competitive by nature. For example, when I did a campus visit at my university in 2015, and I heard that another student studied abroad 6 times, I subconsciously decided that I was going to beat that. I'd go 8 times. I became obsessed with the idea. Although I lived on my own since I was 18, the idea of going on my first study abroad experience was exciting, yet terrifying. My first study abroad trip was to the Dominican Republic for 2 weeks, and on my way home, the airport lost power. This experience built up my confidence, and I considered going abroad again, this time for a little bit longer. My next trip was to Cape Town, South Africa, for 5 months. I had to extend my deadline twice because I was so nervous about going. This trip was, truly, more or less about escaping the life I had at home than for the cultural experience. See, at this point in my life, I had been in an abusive relationship for 8 years. I had layers of trauma that I had never really dealt with back then. I just knew I was good at school. That was my coping mechanism. I believed everything my boyfriend at the time told me about my value and my worth. I hated everything about myself, and the worst thing someone could do was to put me in a room by myself. Before I left on the trip, I managed to put together a list of all the things that I wanted to do and see while in South Africa. I was determined to make the most of this opportunity. I wanted to be engaged, be present, be intentional. By pushing myself out of my comfort zone, and thanks to the physical distance from home, little by little, I began to like myself and to enjoy my time alone. I even went to Botswana by myself, skydiving, bungee jumping, paragliding, and even shark cage diving. The day after I returned home, I made a new commitment to love myself and to live a life less out of habit and more out of intent. For me, studying abroad was an opportunity of self-reflection and discovery, as well as the opportunity to discover the beautiful planet we get to inhabit. I guess I could explain why I've studied abroad 8 times and why I'm going back to South Africa at the end of January for a couple more months to complete an internship and to volunteer. As I look back at those years, I realized I had gotten tired of merely surviving. I wanted to live a life with greater meaning and greater purpose. Too often, we inherit what our family and our community believes in, rather than choosing our own thoughts and opinions and deciding for ourselves what we believe in. Once I realized this, I have been on a mission to ensure that every thought and opinion that I have is because I chose it, rather than it being passed down to me. To accomplish this, I had to define what my values are, how I want others to see me, and what I want to leave behind in this world. One of my favorite quotes is by personal growth consultant Richie Norton. Intentional living means choosing to live your life based on your greatest values, not the habit of others. After I made the decision to live a life full of intentionality, I decided to channel this newfound energy into educational equity, especially for youth in foster care. On any given day, There are nearly 443,000 youth living in the foster care system, and less than 3% graduate from college. That means that 97% of foster youth do not graduate from college, far less have the opportunity to study abroad. I intentionally work with foster youth, Black youth, and marginalized youth because these youth are constantly pushed inside of a box that is limiting and oftentimes toxic and traumatic. I do my best to push these students outside of these limitations. On average, high schoolers receive less than an hour of college advising, including what colleges to apply for and what financial aid is available. My first business was going to be a cereal store called Are You Cereal? I even did my honors thesis on this cereal store. But there was something missing, a core principle of serving others and making my mark on this world. No matter how much I love cereal, which I do, I knew I needed to do something else. And that's why, in 2016, I started The Scholarship Expert, a scholarship coaching business, because I wanted to make sure that students had the skills, strategies, and principles that they need to graduate debt-free. So far, I've helped over 400 students through workshops, mentoring, and sharing my own collegiate journey. I graduated college with over $200,000 in scholarships, and I'm on a mission to help other students become their own scholarship expert. To expand our impact, we developed online courses and an ebook, and actually today, we are releasing both of those in celebration of speaking here with you all. In addition to my business, The Scholarship Expert, I use my passion for intentional relationships to trailblaze and build bridges. I've co-developed our university's first study abroad program with a foreign service component in which students travel to Greece over the summer to work in a refugee camp. Also, I've co-developed my university's first multi-country study abroad program in which students will travel to Rwanda and Uganda over the summer with my fiance. Living your life with more intention in your relationships, school, or your career will work to your benefit as well, as over 80% of jobs are found through personal relationships. We are doing a disservice to ourselves and our communities if we are not living our lives with greater intention. We are not meant to be too independent. We are meant to be interdependent. I encourage you all to live a life less out of habit and more out of intent. The rewards of leading an intentional life are infinite. And that competitive spirit I possess, well, I channel it into finding more and more ways that I can personally make an impact. Thank you.
Our final speaker is Nancy Fairbank. Ms. Fairbank is in her first year at Harvard Law School in Cambridge, Massachusetts, after completing 2 master's degrees as a Marshall Scholar, one at the University of Birmingham in International Development, and the other at the University of Oxford in Global Governance and Diplomacy. Nancy is the author of Throwaway Youth, Stories of Springfield's Homeless Teens, a book chronicling the stories of 5 homeless youths in her hometown, published in 2016 by Missouri State University. She began her association with the Reagan Foundation as a 2012 Great Communicator Debate Series runner-up, where she earned a $7,000 college scholarship, and she then returned in 2016 for the Women's Leadership Conference. Please welcome Nancy to the stage.
Hello. I want to make sure that you all are still awake and engaged after our wonderful student speakers. So I want to start off with another question for you. You can answer just by raising your hands. how many of you are afraid of public speaking? If you had to switch places with me right now, how many of you would not be having such a good day? Seems like a pretty decent amount of folks. And public speaking is one of the most common fears, consistently ranked in the top 3 fears of Americans in annual surveys. I was a little bit of a strange kid growing up, and I actually loved public speaking, which is why I did speech and debate all through high school. And in fact, it was in the building right next door to us that I participated in the first ever Reagan Great Communicator debate series, and got to debate in the championship round under the beautiful Air Force One plane. So I enjoy public speaking, but there are many things that I would be terrified to do in front of an audience. If you tried to get me to come up here and sing, dance, or act, it'd be a hard no. So many of us have these fears of things like public speaking, things like singing. But where do they really come from? We know on a logical level that getting up here and presenting in front of others is a really low risk of causing physical harm. It's not like the stage is gonna open up and swallow me whole, or lightning is gonna strike down from above. What are we really worried about? Well, the risk isn't a physical one. It's an emotional one. When we get up and present in front of others or put ourselves out there, we feel vulnerable. And many of us spend a large portion of our lives trying to avoid vulnerability. But I'm going to try and convince you today that you shouldn't avoid vulnerability. In fact, in order to be an effective leader, you should embrace vulnerability in your life. There are 2 key things that are preventing many of us from embracing vulnerability in leadership. The first is a cultural phenomenon in the US, and it's that when we look at our historical figures that are our role models, people like Ronald Reagan, or the many other presidents that the US has had, those people that we look up to, we often talk about only their successes. We see them as these perfect titans who made flawless decisions and were always strong leaders. And those sort of narratives can be really problematic because it doesn't leave any room for mistake. It doesn't leave any room for vulnerability. And we, as young people, think, well, I could never do that. I'm not that perfect. I have flaws. I could never be that sort of great leader. And this cultural narrative of perfection is exacerbated by a much more modern phenomenon, and that's social media. When we're presenting ourselves on social media, we're presenting our public face, what we want everyone else to see and to know about us. And the public face is part of our story, but it's only one side of it. And it can be really difficult when, as young leaders, you see the great things that everyone else is doing and the one side that they're presenting to the world, and you feel like you might not be able to measure up. So we have these background issues that are preventing us from wanting to show our private face and preventing us from wanting to be vulnerable. But I want to talk a little bit about my leadership journey and how vulnerability has played a very important role. I think vulnerability is necessary both for trailblazing and for bridge building, but I'll start with trailblazing. Part of being an effective trailblazer, part of that sort of leadership, going where others have not gone before, is risk-taking. And risk-taking involves a very special kind of vulnerability, and it's a fear of failure. What if I try out for the sports team and I don't make it and everyone knows? What if I run for student government president and I lose the election? What if I ask out the person I really like and they say no? There are many different situations in life where we feel vulnerable because we're afraid of failing, and it's something that we want to avoid at all costs. But I think that we need to reframe that narrative. Failure, like vulnerability, is not something that we should run from. It's something that first we need to see as an inherent part of the path to leadership. And it's something that second, we need to see that there can often be good things that come from failure. So in terms of the first point, I remember being in college and I applied for this program that I was really excited about, really wanted to get into. And I found out that I was rejected. So I did what many of us do when we're feeling a little bit down. I called my mom. And my mom has always been a hero of mine. She is absolutely the definition of a trailblazer. She's an orthopedic surgeon, and she entered the practice of medicine at a time when there weren't many women doctors at all, let alone women surgeons. So she has overcome a lot of adversity in her leadership journey. And she told me things that day that I had never heard from her before. She told me about how, despite getting good grades and doing everything she was supposed to do, when she applied to residency programs after medical school, not only was she rejected from a number of programs, there were some programs that wouldn't even interview her. And hearing about my mom's failures, but knowing how successful she turned out to be, both as a career woman and as a mom, I saw for the first time that failure could be a part of the path to leadership, that all of these great leaders may now be great, but that they often experienced many failures on that path. And when I was in high school, I saw a great piece that was put out online by a Princeton professor, very accomplished guy. He put out the list of all the failures that he had ever had in his career. Every job he applied for and didn't get, every academic journal that refused to publish his work. And I thought that that was a pretty neat idea. So I started keeping this list in high school. It's gotten pretty long at this point. But the thing that this list helped me realize was that not only is failure often a necessary part of our leadership journeys, it also can turn out to be a good thing in really unexpected ways. And a great example of that is the debate that I did at the Reagan Foundation Great Communicator debate series. So I made it to the final round, was really excited, and I was underneath the Air Force One plane in front of a few hundred people, including my parents. Came down to the final moments, I lost the debate. Not only had I lost a debate, I had lost extremely publicly, and I had to stand up there on stage while it was announced and just process my emotions, congratulate my opponent. And at the time, it felt devastating. It felt like this huge failure that had happened literally in front of hundreds of people. But it wouldn't be until years later that I would realize how important it was that I took that risk. Because if I had never participated in that debate competition, I wouldn't have met the wonderful staff at the Reagan Foundation, and I wouldn't be speaking with you here today. It was through taking that risk, through that willingness to be vulnerable, that I have now made lifelong connections and had wonderful opportunities related to that very first risk and that very first step. So not only is failure an inevitable part of being a leader, but it's also something that can have really positive outcomes. But vulnerability isn't just important in risk-taking and trailblazing. It's also important in bridge building. It's opening up and being vulnerable with other people that allows us to connect on a deeper level, to build trust and to communicate effectively. Now, I can't verify any of this because it's not my field, but I think it's probably an evolutionary thing. When you think of animals, if you were an animal, you wouldn't show another animal your soft, squishy, vulnerable stomach unless you trusted the other animal not to attack you. And so it's the same thing on a mental and emotional level when it comes to people. We're not going to be vulnerable with and open up to other people unless we trust them. So being vulnerable with someone else sends a signal, a mental and emotional signal, that I trust you and you can trust me too. And that allows us to connect a lot more deeply and a lot more quickly. So it's a really important part of bridge building as well. So at this point, you may be saying, this is great. I understand the importance of being vulnerable. I really want to use it in leadership. How in the world do I do it? I mean, do I have to post my actual #JustWokeUpLikeThis selfies on Instagram? Do I have to go out on the nearest street corner and hand out lists of everything I've ever failed at? How do I be vulnerable as a leader? Well, a really important thing that leaders do is they model behavior that they want their teams to engage in. And transformative leadership is about you yourself demonstrating the type of behavior that you want to see in the rest of your team. So I'm not saying that you have to go out there tomorrow and spread all your secrets and share all your failures with the world. It's really a step-by-step process. But you can begin by displaying small instances of vulnerability. And that's a lot easier said than done. So to prove to you that it's possible, I am going to try and model some vulnerability. I've been in an amazing Harvard Graduate School leadership group this year, and this is one of the activities that we did. And it circles back to what I was talking about at the beginning with social media. Because the idea of the activity, it's called competing narratives, is about showing both your public face, what you usually present to the world, the really curated version of yourself, and then showing your private face, things that other people may not know about you, things that you're struggling with, and you might only tell those close to you. So you heard a lot of my public face from Max's wonderful introduction. I'm in my first year at Harvard Law School. I spent the 2 years before that studying in the UK as a Marshall Scholar, and I had both of my dissertations published in academic journals. Prior to that, I was at the University of Texas at Dallas. I was student government vice president, and in 2016, I published a book on youth homelessness, which is a topic that I'm very passionate about. So that's my public face. My private face is a little bit different. Even though I am extremely passionate about poverty and homelessness, I'm not sure whether or not it's something that I want to make the main focus of my career. And I struggle with that a lot, because to leave that issue behind feels like I'm betraying my community. I'm in law school, but I have no idea what type of lawyer I want to be. And it feels like a lot of pressure, especially when many of my classmates know exactly what they want to do. I have had the opportunity to travel a lot, and I've been very fortunate to do that. But I don't have anywhere that feels like home. I moved around a lot as a kid, and my parents live somewhere else now. I really wish that I had deep roots somewhere. And I had a wonderful time in the UK in many ways, but I was surrounded by these amazing, talented people, and I felt a lot of imposter syndrome. Like, how was I here? How was I good enough to be with these wonderful people? I got so stressed during my exam period this last summer that my hair literally started falling out. So I think the important takeaway here is that we all have our public face, but we also have our private face. And it's by being able to be vulnerable with each other that we can find that deeper human connection, that we can create those bonds, and that we can start to progress on our leadership journeys, accepting that failure is an inherent part of that and can often be a positive thing. That's my ask of you today. In those little ways, try and introduce vulnerability into your life and learn that it's not something that we should avoid as leaders, but something that we must embrace. Thank you.
So now we're going to open it up for a little Q&A session. We're going to have staff members and alumni that are going to be coming around with microphones right now. So if you have a question for any of our panelists, whether it has to do with what we talked about upstairs, I'm sure everyone would be willing to give college and career advice. scholarships, anything like that, feel free to raise your hand and somebody will bring you a microphone. Does anyone want to start us off? Perfect, right there in the middle. Thank you for being brave.
I think I could start. And that's a question I got a lot is you're currently an undergraduate student. This seems like something that would come along later. And something that I battled with originally was, okay, I might not possess all the answers right now to answer all of these questions, but my lived experiences, the research that I have done, has allowed me to have some of the answers. And with that, it's like, okay, I can wait until I find the perfect moment, or I can realize that there's never going to be a perfect moment, and I can start with what I know now to start helping the people that I can help now. And once I came to that realization, I was like, okay, we'll get started. We'll collect the resources we have, we'll get the people and the human capital that we have, and then we'll start with this pilot group right here. And then it's not going to be perfect the first time, and as long as we understand that, then it'll get better the second year and the third year. So now with Miracle Mindset, we're entering year 4, and the program began with 30 students, and now we have 500 students. So just starting and utilizing the resources that you have at your disposal, I think that's the biggest piece of advice I'd give.
Yeah. I would say for me, start small. All of us can make an impact in our communities, even on a very small level. For me, it started in high school, and I did the National Honor Society. Even on weekends, I would go out and just try to make an impact in my community. And community is really how you define it. You can have a community online, you can have a community in your school, in college or in high school, or whatever it may be. It just depends on how you define it. And for me, my community is foster youth. So, and that's not just in my community, that's nationwide. So for me, I just understood the needs of that community and trying to figure out what can I do to make an impact. So that's how I began my program. So maybe it's in your own community, figuring out what the issues are and maybe try to strategize different ways that you can solve it.
Yeah, I really agree with Alexis. I think looking to your own community and the impact you can make there is really important. I think that one thing that people don't often consider is the fact that as students, you really have an advantage. So many people want to help students, and you have to have the passion and you have to put the work in, but if you ask for support, there are just an incredible amount of foundations and individuals that want to help support student-led and student-run organizations. So when I was working on my book project to share the stories of homeless youth, I researched and found a professor at Missouri State University, and I wrote a first draft, and I brought it to him, and I said, I would like your help publishing this. And it was crazy. He said yes. And then from there, it actually became really a community project. There was a class of graduate design school students that did all the formatting and layout and all the visuals. We got community grants to help pay for the publishing costs so the proceeds could go back to support homeless youth. So there were really a lot of different parts of the community that stepped up. And I think that as students, you really have an advantage because many people want to help you realize your visions.
I'm going to throw in a quick pitch here on behalf of the foundation. If you're interested in the student leadership program, we kind of help you navigate those problems in your community and identify those. So you should definitely keep an eye out on that. But what other questions do we have? Right here in the front. Oh, if you'll wait for the microphone, just so everyone could hear you. Sorry.
Did you in any way face social issues at school? And if so, did it affect what you've done now?
That is a great question. I think that my work with youth homelessness was in large part inspired by my high school population. There were a lot of homeless youth that attended my high school. And so I think knowing them on a personal level really inspired my work. I think that that's been something that's happened to me later in life as a student as well. I only recently figured out for myself that I was part of the LGBTQ community, and so that's been something that I've been working on getting more involved in law school. We have Lambda, which is a really great organization, and I think working towards those issues of justice for LGBTQ students and people across the country has become really important to me, and I think that's a testament that you can find issues across your life that you're passionate about.
I think for me, new issues resurface and surface up at different stages of life. So I'll mention one that happened this past year during my undergraduate experience. So at the University of Oklahoma for the past 2 years, we've had multiple incidents of blackface on campus. And last year, I worked with diversity enrichment programs, and I was helping promote an event to Spanish-speaking families. And I had a man approach me telling me to go back to Mexico. Why was I speaking Spanish there at that event? And being surrounded by blackface and being surrounded by incidents like those that I encounter, at the moment, it may have felt debilitating, and I may have questioned if the work that I was doing to uplift my communities was even worth it. But then after that moment passed, I really used those moments as motivating forces. Not only, I think it reinforced the idea that there is so much work that still needs to be done, and that work is only going to get done if people like you are occupying those spaces and places and are putting forth the work to do to create those changes. So with that, and that was something that I saw that was really a motivating force in a lot of the students there. After the blackface incident happened on campus, the next day, there was thousands of students on our South Oval with teachers and faculty and professors. So it's really beautiful to see the light that can come out of the dark moments. So yeah.
At the first university that I attended, there wasn't a ton of supports for foster youth. I think foster youth have a lot of things that we need help with in order to be successful in college. I guess that's why less than 3% graduate. And so once I transferred universities, at my university I graduated from, about a quarter of the foster youth in the state actually attend that university. And because of that, there are a lot more supports in place to ensure that we are successful. But I knew that there were limitations, and that's where I tried to come in and try to fill that gap as much as possible, and then spread those services throughout our state, just because there's so many needs that need met, and one program can't fulfill that.
Miguel, you talked a little bit in your speech about coming from a super diverse background in your school and community, and now you're working and majoring in inclusivity and diversity studies. Can you talk to the importance of diversity and inclusion within bridge building and trailblazing specifically?
Yeah. I really think one of the biggest things to keep in mind is whenever we talk about diversity and inclusion, it's not just for the sake of the marginalized communities and those ideas that you're looking to bring in, but true diversity and inclusion really uplifts all communities. And I think that's the biggest thing to keep in mind, is that in a world where diversity and inclusion is really at the core of the work that we're doing, it uplifts your community, it uplifts your work as a bridge builder and as a trailblazer, and it uplifts America as a whole. So, yeah.
Any questions from the audience? Yeah, we have one back here.
Hi, thank you so much for the inspirational speeches that you guys have given. I wanted to ask the question, what does self-care look like to you, and how do you balance it with the passionate work that you do?
Wonderful question.
That's a really tough one. I mean, as I mentioned in my speech, I literally started losing my hair, probably because I was not participating in enough self-care. So that has certainly been a journey for me. I think that also relates to my general topic of vulnerability in two ways. And the first, I think, is that we all need people in our lives that are support and that we can be vulnerable and be open with and trust. And I think that's a really big part of self-care, is investing in and developing those close relationships of support where if we're having struggles in our lives, if we are in a stressful time, that we can reach out and lean on those people. But I think the other thing when it comes to vulnerability and comes to this work in general is that it's important to know your limits. You can't go out there and be everything to everyone. You can't necessarily share beyond what feels safe to you. And you need to put your health first. The work can, I think, be very difficult emotionally and very stressful. And compassion fatigue is a real thing. So I think knowing your limitations and respecting those is really necessary.
Okay. Honestly, we can't help others unless we help ourselves first. At the end of the day, we have to always make sure that we come first. And when we talk about having individuals in our lives that are like our accountability partners or our mentors, that also counts for self-care. So having those individuals in your life that are asking you, what are you doing for self-care? Are you sleeping? Are you drinking enough water? Like, I can't tell you how important that is for me. Say my campus coach that I had on campus, he was constantly asking me, Alexis, did you drink water today? Alexis, how often are you sleeping? I'll randomly take a nap in my car, or I'll randomly take a nap on the bench in the school. And it's because I'm not coming up with these healthy practices of maintaining that self-care.
There's this anecdote I'm going to use. How many people here have flown in an airplane before? Yes, a lot of frequent flyers. So something you know, when you get on an airplane, the stewardess is going to tell you, if we get in an emergency, there's going to be an oxygen mask that falls down, right? And with that oxygen mask, what do they always tell you? They tell you, I don't care if there's a little baby next to you. I don't care if your mom or your grandma's right next to you. I know your first instinct might be, go help that baby. Go help your mom, right? But no, they tell you don't do that. Avoid those instincts. And what do they tell you? Anybody know, what do they tell you to do with the oxygen mask? There you go. Put your own oxygen mask on first. And that was a hard piece of advice for me to accept early on in my academic career. But when I realized it, it really is something so important. Coming from a first-gen low-income background, I saw all these communities and all these issues that I wanted to work on and improve. But if I didn't put on my own oxygen mask, I wasn't going to be able to solve any of those issues. And it took me a little bit to come to that realization. My first semester in college, and I always would say, I'm doing this for my family, and I'm doing this for all those students that look like me and come from similar backgrounds as me. But my first semester of college, I went 3 months without calling my parents. And I was like, no, you're not. You might be telling yourself that, but those aren't the reasons you're doing it. If I spent day and nights in the library, I felt like I was working all the time. And then, like you mentioned, I had a friend who would come up to me, and she would stop me as I'm walking to class, and she said, Miguel, have you eaten today? And it was 3 p.m., and I tell her, I haven't. She's like, Miguel, go get food. And people like that are so important. So remember, go get food. Whatever you're doing can wait. Go eat breakfast and sleep and run and do your hobbies, and don't let all those things fall to the side as you're pursuing this work and advocacy and all this work that you want to be doing.
Both Miguel and Alexis, y'all talked about specific individuals who are holding you accountable, or the ones that make you sleep, and the mentors. How do you as young leaders find those mentors in your community or those around you? And how important is that relationship for you?
Yeah, so you're going to have a different mentor in different seasons of your life. Say if you're in high school or in college or your professional career. And I honestly have mentors in my professional life and also for my personal life. And it's really those individuals that you look up to. Say that they have a skill that you would like to possess, or they're in your certain career path that you would just like to learn from. So it's finding those individuals that you look up to. And for me, that's really how I got to where I am today, just because I love meeting new people and I love learning. So coming from that point of view and that lens, when I walk into a room, I try to figure out who can I speak to, who can I learn from. And so finding those individuals, but then maintaining that relationship, I think that's the most important thing, because you can have coffee with somebody, you can go out to dinner with somebody, but that relationship doesn't really mean anything if you don't find a way to maintain that.
For me, I really think when thinking about the concept or the idea of mentorship, I think it exists on 3 levels. The first being down, right? Look down, and how can you be a mentor to somebody? How can you look back and through all the things that you've gone through, how can you help someone get to that position, right? The second level is just straight across, peers. How can you work with people that are going through the same boat that you are, and how can you uplift each other through the hard stuff, and how can you celebrate each other when the accomplishments happen? And the last level is up, right? Where do you see yourself going? Where do you aspire to be? And who are the people that have been there before? And really the biggest thing that I've had to learn, and I think I'm still trying to master this, is just reach out to someone. Send them a DM on Instagram and tell them, hey, I think this is really incredible what you're doing. Gas them up in a text message and then say, could I buy you coffee or something? People love to talk about themselves. Most of the time the answer is going to be yes. They'll take you up on that and then they'll buy you the coffee. But yes, I think it's really important to remember to not only take, but that mentorship should exist on these 3 different levels.
So true.
We have time for another audience question. Yeah, right there. The microphone's on the way.
What's the hardest lesson you've had to learn?
Ooh, I think picking the hardest is difficult. I've definitely learned a couple hard lessons in leadership, but I think I really had to transform the idea of what I thought leadership was, and that was a really big part in my journey. I think, again, I really bought into this narrative of leadership being very top-down and hierarchical, and the person at the top having to be this flawless, perfect being. And I definitely had some issues trying to achieve that. And I also created issues because I don't think it's the best model for leadership. In student government, which I did a lot in college, when I would try and just dictate how things would be, people obviously did not respond very well. So I think it was a hard lesson, but an important lesson, realizing that building consensus and getting everyone's voice involved in the process was extremely important, that it was not the best form of leadership for me to just decide what should be done, but to get a variety of ideas, to hear out what people with different experiences thought, and to really listen to other people. And so I think that sort of consensus building and learning how important that was, which was a huge shift in how I thought about leadership.
Do you have one?
Sure. As I mentioned in my speech, one of the most difficult things for me to overcome was just learning to like myself and love myself. Honestly, I can't help other people, again, if I don't have that same love and respect for myself. But another huge barrier that I had to overcome was being able to live my life without every single second being planned. In high school, if I didn't bring my planner with me, I would call home sick. Like, I was that person. If I didn't have every moment of my life planned out, I mean, I would have full meltdowns. There were several times when I would leave work crying just because plans would change that day, and I couldn't handle it. I couldn't handle change. I couldn't handle things happening on the fly. But now I'm like, just go with it. Look, life happens. It is what it is. Like, I'll figure it out. Like, say I'm going to South Africa for 5 months, and I don't know what I'm doing when I get there. It's okay. But that was not me. In high school, I mean, meltdowns all the time if I didn't have that planner. Now I have my planner on my phone, and that's perfectly fine. So it's that adjustment to being an adult and being flexible, really.
I think for me, it might be that you can't be everything for everyone. And throughout the past 4 years, there's been a ton of social issues that have sprung up, and I've often found myself either spread too thin or battling with the idea of, I just don't have enough time. I have this exam happening, I can't attend this protest or this march. And I realize that advocacy has many forms. And if you're passionate about an issue, Yes, right? That can look like going out and marching and going out and protesting and going out and rallying, and that's important and that has its place. But that can also look like graduating, right, and getting your degree. So advocacy can look like a lot of forms, and you don't have to get sucked into just one form all the time for every issue. I think it's important to figure out those key issues that are close to your heart and go all out, whatever those are, right, issues that you'll be willing to die for. But you can't be willing to die for everything, because then you're going to live a short life.
Well, thank you so much to our wonderful panelists for being here and answering these questions for us.